Hey everyone, this is your review of To Kill a Mockingbird Chapter 2. Remember that this is not supposed to be a substitute for reading the chapter. We are just going to review some of the ideas I hope you noticed and explain some of the literary devices and writing techniques that Harper Lee uses in the novel. So this chapter is primarily about Scout's first day at school, and so is Chapter 3. One of the things that you notice at the very beginning of the chapter is the fact that it's noted that before the end of the morning, Scout gets in trouble somehow because she's made to stand in the corner until noon, kind of like a timeout. It's a little bit like foreshadowing. We don't know exactly what of. Foreshadowing in many cases can be a lot more subtle than this. But whatever happens in this chapter, it's going to end with Scout having a timeout. So Miss Caroline is Scout's teacher, and she's a young teacher, was no more than 21. This whole first paragraph physically describes her, but if you look carefully at the description, it kind of paints a picture of what Scout expects Miss Caroline's personality to be like. She had bright auburn hair, pink cheeks, wore crimson or red fingernail polish, high-heeled pumps, a red and white striped dress. She looked and smelled like a peppermint drop. So what does this description of her show? It goes on further when Miss Caroline reveals that she's from North Alabama, from Winston County. Her class murmured apprehensively. Should she prove to harbor her share of peculiarities indigenous to that region? And I hope you notice the root word of peculiarities, peculiar or strange, indigenous or originating from that region. When Alabama seceded from the Union on January 11, 1861, Winston County seceded from Alabama, and every child in Macomb County knew it. Whenever you see a sentence that has something like, and everybody knew it, you know instinctively that it's something shameful. So everyone is apprehensive about the fact that their new teacher, who's new to town, is from Winston County. And it gives the impression that they're snobby about her southernness or her claim to being Alabamian. They don't think much of her, it seems like. A possible theme that this could relate to is the idea of prejudice. Prejudice, when we talk about it, often refers to race, which is really unfortunate, but it's not always racial. Prejudice can exist in many different forms. In this case here, it can be regional. Oh, Miss Caroline, our new teacher, is from that part of Alabama. So there is going to be already a wall between the teacher and the students in this class, especially Scout. Not necessarily because of the North Alabama part, but you'll see. Well, you probably should have already seen. One of the other things that shows that Miss Caroline is completely disconnected from understanding her audience, basically, her class, is that she reads them a cute little story about cats being very creative, and she seemed unaware that the ragged, denim-skirted, and flour-sack-skirted first grade. So flour-sack skirt, that means they're kids wearing clothing made out of old flour sacks. Most of these kids who had chopped cotton and fed hogs from the time they were able to walk were immune to imaginative literature. So that kind of description highlights how hardworking these children are. They've been that way their whole lives because it's a rural farming county. They don't have time for stories. But Miss Caroline isn't even aware of that. She is just saying, oh, wasn't that nice? And she realizes that maybe her students aren't connecting to that at all. So there's a disconnect between her teaching style and her students. Harper Lee continues to use the variation in her style, in her sentence styles, for emphasis. She had this big paragraph about Miss Caroline being unaware that her students couldn't connect to the way she was teaching. And then she introduced the alphabet, and she just turns to the class and says, does anybody know what these are? Everybody did. Most of the first grade had failed it last year. So again, This highlights two things. She is unaware of who her students are, that these are repeat failed first graders, and it also allows her to show some of the narrator's personality. There's a kind of joke punchline used with a single sentence paragraph, and you'll see that throughout the book. Now we're getting to the more important part of this chapter, how this first day of school forms Scout's general impressions about the public school system and why she hates it. Scout is a precocious child. She already knows how to read from not just her first reader, her textbook, but she can read stock market quotations from the Mobile Register, so the local newspaper. Her teacher, Miss Caroline, assumes that Atticus taught her, but Atticus didn't directly teach Scout. Scout's kind of surprised because she didn't realize that she just learned to read from being in a very literature-rich environment. There are books all around the house. Her father's a lawyer. He doesn't adjust a lot of his vocabulary when he talks to his children, and it's in this way that Scout just naturally learned to read. Scout is actually upset because it sounds like she is getting the message from Miss Caroline that she shouldn't know how to read before first grade, and her teacher is already displeased with her instead of being very impressed that Scout already knows how to read. So again, this disconnect between Miss Caroline and Scout, and as well as Scout's disconnect. This is not what school was supposed to be, but here I am at school and my teacher is yelling at me for already knowing how to read. So it also is kind of ironic, the teacher telling Scout, hey, have your father stop teaching you. You need to stop reading at home. There's a great example of diction over here, using elevated language to characterize what her mindset was as a child. Scout mumbled, I was sorry and retired meditating upon my crime. I never deliberately learned to read, but somehow I'd been wallowing illicitly in the daily papers. So illicitly means illegally, and you can see here as well when it says my crime. Of course, knowing how to read by the time you get to first grade isn't really a crime, but Scout's being made to feel like it is. So she's being made to feel shame for this, and that's so crazy because she thought she would love school. She loves learning. She loves reading. She's been looking forward to it for a long time. I also highlighted this quote because it helps develop Scout's character. She's being told to stop reading at home, so she thinks, until I feared I would lose it, I never loved to read. One does not love breathing. So she is comparing reading to something as essential for life, like breathing. And she didn't even realize that she had loved it. She just kind of took it for granted because it was such a part of her daily life. This isn't the only thing that causes Scout to have a bad first day at school. Before we get to that, there is a great section here where during recess she complains to her older brother Jem, and he tells her that's just the way they're teaching first grade now. It's new. It's the Dewey Decimal System, which I think some of you might recall is the call numbers on library books. Scout, having never questioned Jem's pronouncements, just kind of takes that idea at face value. She believes it to be true. So it's another way that she is young and naive or gullible. She is a child still. She knows how to read and she's incredibly smart, but she's incredibly naive in many other ways. Okay. The second most important part of this chapter is Walter Cunningham. When they are ready to go for lunch, for the proper lunch break, it turns out that Walter doesn't have any money, but he doesn't reveal that at first. And Miss Caroline once again demonstrates how she just doesn't know about Maycomb society. Everyone else knows that he doesn't have money to pay back any borrowed lunch money from Miss Caroline. It doesn't say it directly at first, but you can kind of see the descriptive details. The author chooses to show that they saw a muscle jump in his skinny jaw and that his jaw twitched again. So there's that signpost again. Again, what does that tell you? Walter is lying about forgetting his lunch money. He never had any to begin with. At first, when everybody tries to explain why he is the way he is, they just say, well, Walter's a Cunningham. Everybody knows that. It made things sufficiently clear. Maycomb is a place of predictability and set ways and set beliefs and knowledge about people. So Miss Caroline is kind of a stand-in for us, the reader, as well. We're learning all of this through her, but we're not in the story, so we're not being embarrassed about it. And that's an ongoing theme of To Kill a Mockingbird, that the culture, and that's part of our unit theme as well, identity and culture. Part of the culture of Maycomb is so set in their ways that any kind of progress or any kind of change, any kind of deviation from the way everybody expects things to go causes a lot of conflict. And by the end of the school day, Miss Caroline had whipped, quote unquote whipped, she just kind of patted Scout's hands with a ruler for embarrassing her about the Walter Cunningham incident. And that goes back to the beginning of the chapter. The very end of the chapter also is very telling. The last lines were, had Miss Caroline's conduct been more friendly toward me, I would have felt sorry for her. She was a pretty little thing. So that last comment really takes Miss Caroline down a peg. Scout doesn't think much of her. Someone who doesn't know the way things are in Maycomb or would hold it against others for not understanding the reality of everything. That kind of person is penalized. And you'll see this elsewhere in the book. It's ironic, too, because Scout realizes that the way things are in Maycomb and these set beliefs about people aren't necessarily all that they appear to be. So that is a theme that you should pay attention to going forward.